Hello, welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us, and welcome to today's lecture, which is an interview with Benjamin Moss, the core writer and dear colleague of mine who helped create the Critical Thinking series. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Very grateful that you were able to, attend these lectures. I know that you're very busy, and we're both very busy with our work internally. Yeah, I think it's wonderful to have you on here.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, I really enjoy this, and I'm very passionate about teaching critical thinking. So I wanted to ensure that I was here to be able to talk with you about this because we are both teaching on critical thinking, and we're both instructors. And given our background, it's definitely something that I think we're both very passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought to begin, we could maybe just have you introduce yourself a little bit and your academic journey and background.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see here. So right now I'm a associate professor at Yale College. I teach philosophy, and I have a background in teaching philosophy. Prior to that, I ended up getting my master's degree at San Francisco State University in philosophy. And then I also have another master's degree at SUNY at Albany, where I also studied philosophy. My area of interest and background at San Francisco State was primarily focused on issues that pertain to applied ethics and also moral psychology. But then I kind of dabbled in philosophy of mind when I was at SUNY at Albany. And so right now, as I mentioned earlier, I am very eager to talk about my background and interest in critical thinking. I had a slight, interest in teaching high school students for a while. So I ended up getting my credential and taught high school for a couple of years. And from that experience, it showed me that high schools really need to start teaching critical thinking in school much better. I think there's a serious problem right now with being able to have students access material where they can actually learn critical thinking skills.
Yeah, definitely a paucity of critical thinking, I think, across the educational board. I think that's something we both probably agree on.
Yeah, definitely.
So when did you get the critical thinking bug specifically?
Yeah, so it kind of became interesting to me organically because given my experience in teaching high school, having students learn kind of the essential skills, the analytical reasoning abilities that are taught in philosophy is something that really sparks my interest. As you know, somebody who also studies philosophy, critical thinking is a course that's often taught at the undergraduate level. And at least it was the case when I was at San Francisco State that it was a required course for all undergraduates to take. And it was a very good idea because critical thinking courses, of course, equipped undergraduates with analytical reading and writing abilities that you often don't really see that much in other disciplines. And so having undergraduates be able to clearly and articulately write arguments was essential. It's an important skill. And throughout my journey in academia, I realized that oftentimes I felt like a lot of students were deficient in those skills and really needed to kind of learn them. But more broadly, I think in today's world, critical thinking is so important. If you go on social media, for example, or you experience any kind of popular culture influence, you can see that critical thinking is an invaluable skill to learn. It's very, very crucial that individuals need to start studying it today.
Yeah, and so that's beautifully said. And then that interest, of course, it culminated for you. It's been a couple of years now, but you wrote a book, which is amazing. And I believe that the core material of the book was actually what furnished this version of your material that you have on critical thinking for this series. So I wanted to know if you wanted to speak a little bit about what it's like to write a book on critical thinking and, maybe what your ambitions were at the time. And
yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things about writing a book that was interesting is because it definitely took me time to write this book, but to me, it was just kind of initially designed to be a primer in critical thinking. I really wanted to write a book that this could be very approachable as a subject matter to undergraduates, and they could quickly grasp different key concepts in critical thinking. Originally, I created it kind of to supplement my courses because, where I'm currently teaching, there's no course that's, a critical thinking course. And given the nature of the subject matter, I thought it would be essential to create this right now. And so after having a couple of conversations with a few folks in academia about the importance of critical thinking, it really just, it needed to be created. So my book is called Critical Thinking: Unleashing the Power of Reason. It was actually published in 2023. And so the book is just a broad overview of a variety of topics that are often discussed in like an undergraduate critical thinking course. But I think one thing that differentiates this book from, let's say a textbook is that this book is supposed to be clear and concise, where it basically tries to take a lot of the key concepts and demystifies them, and ensures that it's palatable and interesting enough. It was originally designed not really to be a textbook necessarily, but more of like a supplementary text that individuals could read to, have a primer available.
Yeah, and that makes me think, of course, something that's very unique about your book is if you wanted to compare it in genre to something like Strunk and White's, English manual, which is like, 10 pages, but you learn everything about English in it. If that's something comparable to what you're doing with your text, what's interesting, of course, is that you don't start with just the rudiments of argumentation and you get into the little, you don't just start right at the beginning, but instead you sort of start at the end by talking about the intellectual virtues, which, as I tried to present in the lecture series, was sort of the payout if you pay attention to critical thinking. So I wanted to know if you would like to speak a little bit about like why start at the end?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this was something that I grappled with a lot because initially when I designed the book and outlined for it, it actually wasn't going to be the initial chapter one. It actually was, I planned to make this kind of one of the last chapters of the book, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
So one of the main reasons I chose this as a topic to discuss first is because you're absolutely right. It is kind of a payoff to a certain respect. I wanted to make sure that we could have whoever's reading this cultivate intellectual virtues, and the purpose of it, of course, is to create habits, intellectual habits that are created as a result of thinking that is rigorous and becomes habituated over time. So, for example, if an individual is using logical reasoning, for example, and they're consistently utilizing that logical reasoning on an everyday basis, then it can become a form of habit. So I really wanted to approach this kind of also intuitively. So rather than thinking about critical thinking as this abstract discipline with logic, which can be very intimidating, I wanted to approach this from a very kind of commonsensical and intuitive perspective by talking about these intellectual virtues first. I think people are very familiar with them, and they are, the key habits of what constitutes a good thinker. So that was kind of the main reason why I decided to talk about this first.
Yeah, it's a wonderful approach because I think it sort of disarms people if they are able to see at the beginning, like, this is what I have it in me to become if I kind of put the work in here. So it's very good. And it makes me think a little bit as well of, how Socrates, and so internally we're at the level of talking about Socrates and we haven't quite reached that on the public side of things. But, one of the things that the many virtue ethicists present to you is to find someone to emulate, right? Find a sage or someone to emulate. And something that's kind of neat about your approach to teaching critical thinking, which of course we've benefited from on this side, is that, you've given us something to emulate. You've given us like a lodestar to guide our approach through this material. And I thought that was actually really well thought out.
Yeah. So, it's really great that you bring this up about moral exemplars because, Interestingly enough, when I was writing this, I was reading a lot of work on Stoicism. For example, I was reading about Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and I kept thinking about, Socrates as the sage, as a moral exemplar, and how the Stoics, for example, they were highly disciplined, and their goal is to really foster critical thinking skills in the same way. And one application was to reflect and meditate on the sage, right, on Socrates as this kind of moral exemplar. If you were asked what a Stoic needs to do, they need to be like Socrates. So it's an excellent starting point, from kind of a philosophical point of view as a thought experiment, right? Because when you approach critical thinking as a subject matter, if you emulate the kinds of intellectual virtues that excellent critical thinkers have, then all of those qualities of character come after. So I think it is kind of a unique perspective in the critical thinking world, but it's one that's very important.
Yeah, I love to hear that too. I mean, from working with me that I love the Stoics. So, I'm not surprised to actually learn that based on the outline of your book. So that's really great. So I thought we could shift gears next and maybe just talk a little bit about the first 3 lectures that we presented and just give you a chance to speak on the content of them. So the first lecture, as you know, you wrote you wrote the material, is just simply introducing critical thinking and what the power of critical thinking, as you put it. I wanted to give you an opportunity to just speak about what value or importance or what have you that, giving this on the public side, what benefit there is to that.
Yeah, critical thinking is essential today. I start off the book in my introduction by talking about living in an information-rich world. In the age of artificial intelligence, or living in literally the information age. There's so much information that we're constantly presented with. So my broader goal of creating this book really was to equip individuals with these skills so that when they are encountering information that they want to call into question, like, for example, the problem with disinformation and misinformation, then they can at least have these skills that are really necessary in today's world. So, in a way, this was a book that was intended to act as preparation for real life, right, rather than just being in the classroom. But, this book, I really also, I took out a lot of the work that involved symbolic logic and reasoning, in part because I think that can be very intimidating to individuals who don't have that kind of background in formal logic. And I think this approach by going through, a textbook that acts as preparation for the real world is a lot more intuitive and interesting to individuals who want to approach this, who are unfamiliar with critical thinking or philosophy.
Yeah, and that makes me think I should have actually started with asking you just to define what critical thinking is on your side. Something I did say at the beginning of the series, I tried to give a very loose definition of what critical thinking was, which is essentially just thinking well, which is about as general as you can get, and more general even than you had presented. But the other thing one way I tried to define is by saying what it was not, which is, we're not really looking too deeply into, for instance, symbolic logic. So yeah, maybe you could just speak a little bit about what critical thinking is.
Absolutely. So critical thinking is thinking critically.
Yeah, exactly.
The goal of it, of course, is to think well. I do like that approach. In fact, that's often how logic is approached, right? Logic is a normative discipline that informs us how we ought to think. It's the standard of right thinking. It's not how actually people think in the real world, right? I mean, that's descriptive, and cognitive psychology shows that individuals are filled with different biases and prejudice, and so there's individuals in real life and the real world are often not capable of logical reasoning. But this approach is intended to be kind of a normative theory that applies to thinking. And so critical thinking is, what differentiates it from something like uncritical thinking, for example, is, belief, right? So belief is fundamental. And if individuals believe something without evidence or reason, for instance, that's accepted as uncritical. So what we need to do is we need to create kind of an attitude of critical thinking, right? We need to create a atmosphere where individuals are aware of their own beliefs through something like metacognition, right? They're aware of their own beliefs and justification, but are approaching it from a skeptical point of view as well, where they don't believe every single thing that they encounter. So really, critical thinking, I think the definition itself it's important, to understand what critical thinking is as a discipline, but it's more of an activity. It's more of a set of skills. Like, for example, you can play baseball, and you can learn all the rules there are to playing baseball, for example, right? You might learn every single, abstract rule that applies to the game, but when you're actually playing baseball, it's very different as an activity. There can be folks who don't know all the rules, but are very good at playing baseball. And so in the same way, critical thinking is itself an activity. Some people call it informal logic, informal reasoning, because, it's not maybe as rigorous as, including symbolism and logic. But logic and critical thinking are very much, they're tied together as a discipline. But critical thinking is more informal in some sense.
It's interesting you say that, because I would almost think that, the classical definition of like informal and formal logic is just the use of the language. So you either have a natural language or a symbolic language. And you might think that a natural language would actually be more difficult to wield logically because of the nature of language. But something that you said that I have to bend your ear a little bit about, I think you nailed it actually. You said that critical thinking is an activity, but it's normative in nature and not descriptive. So I hadn't thought about this from that perspective. And when I was, we haven't gotten to this yet in the series publicly, but something that, in the Socratic method, which we'll get to, Socrates is absolutely 100% open-minded, but there is a normative approach that he takes, and he sacrifices everyone's conversation on the altar of logic. And that is because there's an ought there. So I'm actually kind of curious. This is a heck of a question to ask, but I'm curious. It's coming. How do you derive the ought out of a description of what it means to think well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do like it, and we can use Socrates' conversations as an example. I talk about formal logic as the objective analysis and evaluation of information to form reasoned judgments. That's a very formal definition, but really, when we're in the real world and we're approaching kind of critical thinking as a skill or an ability, Socrates, for example, he strove to understand individuals' assumptions, and one of the reasons for that is he wanted to understand what's true, right? As a philosopher, as a lover of wisdom, he approached individuals by examining their assumptions and reflecting on their deeply held beliefs and convictions. And his goal is to understand what somebody believes. Now, even though he might, for example, be engaging in certain conversations, the descriptive part of it is evaluating his conversations, evaluating his beliefs, his language. And so what is normative, though, is evaluating the norms and the standards that apply to rational beliefs. Just because people are a certain way doesn't mean they ought not to do that, right? So in the same way, right, we can, talk about, critical thinking as a discipline. Just because people, believe something they see online, it doesn't necessarily mean they need to believe that. They ought not to. They ought to be skeptical and think about why they believe it and evaluate their own beliefs and examine their own assumptions. So I think that, Socrates is an excellent example. He often said in conversations that, he was driven by his demon, right? we might even consider that like a form of conscience, right? Like he wanted to really, truly reconcile with individuals to understand what is in fact true, to get the truth out of their conversations. And to do that, he was driven by this kind of internal commitment, his belief that he had to say something. to understand what knowledge is.
Yeah, and then of course the apex of this is, when he's on trial and about to commit forced suicide, his argument is, you shouldn't be jailing me, you should be paying me for teaching the Athenians, right? So there's this idea of even though he was questioning and proceeding through the Socratic method, there was an ought being demonstrated, which is this is the way we ought to discourse or ought to think.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example about, his, like in the Apology, for example, he chooses to drink the hemlock rather than, escape with the jailer. And he was given that choice. And what's so fascinating about that is he'd rather say something that's truthful and correct rather than, lying or losing a certain amount of integrity. Integrity is a kind of intellectual virtue, right? In that sense, too, being right is better than just giving up and admitting that you're wrong or, taking the easy way out, for example. So it's a certain kind of consistency in his character that's important, that makes him a moral exemplar, I think, amongst Stoics.
Thinking of Stoics, actually, as you were speaking, I thought of a quote of Seneca who said, "The truth is the easiest thing to remember because it's consistent." And I think that's actually really well said. So that actually bridges us to the next two podcasts, which were a sort of mini lecture series on the intellectual virtues. I'm actually curious why you picked the collection of intellectual virtues that you picked.
Yeah, sure. So really what I wanted to do is, it's a great question. It was difficult for me to figure out exactly which intellectual virtues that I wanted to choose. I do discuss, for example, curiosity. I think curiosity is fundamental as an intellectual virtue. I think that, individuals who aren't curious are not critical thinkers. So I think, it's necessary and sufficient that you have to have this character trait in order to truly be an excellent critical thinker. Just kind of going back to the conversation about Socrates and talking about these intellectual exemplars, I wanted to also talk about how critical thinking as the discipline is also good to understand it as, thinking like a philosopher, right? Philosophers are uniquely equipped with these kind of intellectual virtues, many of them, right? Curiosity as central to doing work in philosophy. To being a lover of wisdom, one needs to possess this character trait to really be good at doing it. So I think curiosity is something that it needs to be cultivated. Not everybody has curiosity. That's not something that's always innate. But it's also one that is central to becoming a critical thinker. You have to be curious and want to seek out new information and ask questions about your world. Merely that just being content with your place in it, right? Being satisfied with the answers, for example, is not a sign of curiosity. We need individuals who can navigate challenges, think of different solutions, and call into question the assumptions that we often take for granted in our daily life.
Yeah, that's really well said. And one of the other intellectual virtues that you need in order to achieve what you just mentioned, of course, is courage, which you immediately identified. And something that I thought was, I have such a privileged position giving these lectures because in the process of teaching, I'm absorbing and learning your content in a way that I wasn't able to do as I was reading through it and preparing my lecture notes. And something that I noticed with courage is, we have a general sense of what courage is, which is essentially something like acting in the face of fear. But how do you translate that into an intellectual virtue? Because that's very specific.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think they're similar. Courage is considered to be a cardinal virtue, right? Aristotle talks extensively about courage being, in his doctrine of the golden mean, it's, something in between something like rashness and cowardice, right? And so in the same way, courage it's an intellectual virtue because courage of the intellect is something that applies directly to how critical thinkers, for example, approach new challenges, new problems. It really got me started to think about, in psychology, for example, there's a lot of discussion about, cultivating a growth mindset, for example. And these are, habits of thinkers too, in the same way that we often think of different virtues. And so being courageous is something that does require a certain growth mindset, right? You need to be willing to approach new information and not cower away, for example, when you're approaching a subject matter that maybe you're afraid to learn or you don't want to challenge yourself, for example. All too often are there individuals who have a fixed mindset, for example, who are not courageous, who do not want to approach new information, who would rather, learn something easy, for example, rather than challenging themselves. So yeah, I do think courage is in fact an intellectual virtue here, because somebody like, for example, Socrates, who could in fact, talk about questions and challenge the status quo, that involves a lot of courage to do, to speak out publicly about these controversial issues in a public forum. It's not easy. I mean, he was eventually sentenced to death for doing that, but at least he was courageous enough to talk about it.
That makes me think, too, of one of our colleagues internally. He mentioned how Aristotle recognized the importance of fear in instigating the capacity for courage. So I'm kind of curious if you think, how would you include the emotion of fear as a kind of, I think the answer is no, but an intellectual virtue, or what role does the emotions play in fostering the intellectual virtues, in your opinion, if any?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, my thesis was primarily aimed at analyzing kind of how the emotions and reason often work together in a certain way. And much of this had to kind of explore social psychologists' work, Jonathan Haidt, on discussing, for example, his model of the emotions. And so, fear is definitely something that is associated with, the amygdala, for example, in the brain. And so cognitive psychologists recognize those kinds of fear responses, whereas our prefrontal cortex, for example, is responsible for reasoning and higher level thinking. And so, one question that I really tried to understand in my thesis was trying to understand Aristotle's problem of the weakness of the will, acrasia, right? Acrasia is a major philosophical problem where just in case our listeners are not familiar with this, acrasia is a philosophical problem where Aristotle believed that individuals can act morally. They can cultivate virtues. But when, for example, individuals, let's say, give into temptation or they're easily persuaded by emotional persuasion, then Aristotle would classify that as a weakness of will. And that's kind of maybe a solution to the problem about why individuals don't always act rational, maybe why they're persuaded by certain kinds of temptations. So, Ryan, going back to your question about fear, individuals in certain situations are absolutely, they're persuaded by their own kind of biological or repetitive emotions, right? They often will, like a soldier who is fearful, might abandon his post, for example. And the Stoics were really, really fascinated in this issue. They believed, of course, that, we need to kind of suppress those emotional desires and not let them take the reins, whereas, reason is really supposed to be the one in control. So it is an interesting issue. And, if you want to apply this to intellectual virtues, for example, let me just give you a simple real-life example. Testing anxiety is something that a lot of, our students have, right? And testing anxiety is an example where we might be fearful to take an exam. We might be fearful, for instance, to study a certain subject matter because we might find it too challenging. But when we let fear, for example, take the reins, then we're kind of abandoning our posts, so to speak, right? But instead, we should be rational and, realize that this is only temporary, and that we shouldn't let our fear totally guide our actions in those situations.
So I'm always trying to find the moral in the story, and it almost makes me think that what you're suggesting essentially is, obviously the emotions aren't intellectual virtues by definition, but maybe as as possessors of emotions and practitioners of philosophy and striving after becoming more critical in our thinking, maybe a rule of thumb is to think of the emotions as those signals or opportunities given to us to mark when we are actually able to practice a virtue at this point, right? So if I feel fear in a moment, this is an opportunity for me to practice my virtue.
Yeah, I think that, we should just ignore or suppress our emotions. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is that the Stoics, for example, thought that we should just suppress our emotions, right? I mean, that's what Stoic means in English, right, today. But that's just not the case. The Stoics were very aware that we do have emotions. We can accept our emotions and embrace them, but we should also try to make reasoned and clear decisions. When we, for example, when we talk about fallacies, there's a fallacy called appeal to emotion, right? We can, for example, see a infomercial late at night where, you might see something that is emotional, right? That tries to persuade us to donate money to a cause, for example. And when we're driven solely by our emotions, right, then that's problematic, right? We need to have rational grounds for donating to that charity. We need to think more about whether or not this is a legitimate charity, right? We should be skeptical. And so we should just simply be persuaded by appealing to emotion alone.
Yeah, that's really well said. So I think for the last question here is I just wanted to ask, what are you currently working on now, and what can people look forward from your atelier, your workshop?
Great, thank you. So one thing that I've been working on, actually there are a couple of projects that I'm independently working on right now. I actually created an application that uses artificial intelligence to analyze arguments. So one application, for example, what it will do is it allows you to copy and paste your argument, and then it automatically puts it in standard form. It evaluates it for implicit assumptions called enthymemes. That way you can kind of make your reasoning more conscious and aware and objective. And then the other thing it does too, which is really good, is it provides feedback and suggestions. And then more importantly, it provides a Socratic kind of feedback, where it provides different advice and asks you questions about that argument. So that's just one project. I've also created another application that allows you to write ethical arguments. And so my goal and kind of the method I think that's really important is putting these arguments in standard form. For example, it goes in premise and conclusion form, and it makes the argumentation really explicit. So individuals can objectively evaluate that reasoning. And so I think it's a very important tool right now. I think all too often, we hear arguments every day. And I think this is a very useful tool that shows how artificial intelligence, for example, should be thought of as a form of augmented intelligence to help individuals have a better understanding of their reasoning.
That gets me wanting to ask you about AI and all these things, because I know that you're probably the mini expert within the college on that stuff, and not only being critical of it and skeptical of it, but also charitable, right? So you definitely see the ways that it can be used for the better. And I mean, I think this project that you just mentioned is testament to that. And hopefully, as the project gets fine-tuned, it's something that we could share with the public, or maybe at the end of the series or something. I've tinkered around with the apps, and they're a lot of fun. Also, just the transparency, right, with the enthymemes, this idea of creating transparency of thought. It's very cool that you were able to create a version of that, like a physical version of what clarity looks like.
Yeah, I do think it's incredibly important today to have that kind of clarity, because all too often individuals are just simply not consciously aware of their own reasoning. And so making that transparent where they can evaluate those assumptions is incredibly important for critical thinking as a skill.
Well, for now, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I know you're very busy, but as I promised, I told people that you have a fine mind, and it's a pleasure to see you think, and I think that has been demonstrated today. I certainly had a blast. So hopefully we'll be able to get you in a couple more times before we wrap the series up. But for now, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's my pleasure, and I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I look forward to having more of these interviews that are great to contribute to this. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And for now, I'll invite everyone to join me next time for our 2-part mini series on the Socratic method. Take care.